Hey, what's up everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are continuing our Throne of Eldraine limited set review, this time with the red card. So if you're that guy in the comments who really likes Skirk Prospector for some reason, this is the video for you. We're going to look at every single red card in the set, from common all the way up to mythic rare, and we are going to rank them into categories, starting with the weaker sideboard build-around type cards, all the way up to the bombiest of the bomb red cards. If you haven't seen any of these videos yet, go ahead and check out the rest of the playlist. Let me know in the comments below whether it's useful, whether you agree or disagree with any of the card evaluations. And as always, you can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. Let's go ahead and kick this thing off. So starting with the sideline cards, again, these are cards that don't typically make your main board, either because they're unplayable, because they are sideboard cards which come in post board, or they are build around cards that require something else to be going on in your deck, and they won't make the cut without those cards. The first one, Blow Your House Down, 2 in a red for a common sorcery. Up to 3 target creatures can't block this turn. Destroy any of them that are walls. So this is a falter type effect, and falters don't always make the main board. You have to be a very aggressive deck or a big stompy deck in order for this to be something that you want. If you're playing any kind of control deck, which red won't tend to be hard control, then this is probably not a card you want. If you're trying to win through incremental advantage and card advantage, then Blow Your House Down is just not typically a card that you're interested in. For instance, blue-red, the archetype that cares about having multiple draws per turn to get your cards going, probably doesn't want a card like Blow Your House Down, whereas a red-white Knight aggro deck might want this as kind of a way to push in damage. The problem, of course, is that this doesn't just say creatures your opponents control can't block this turn. If your opponent has a bunch of tokens or a bunch of creatures on board, this isn't really going to do what you want it to do, which is make it so that your opponent can't block at all. Also, the wall part doesn't matter too much. I think there are 2 walls in this set. There's definitely an artifact wall, and there might be another one that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But sure, you can board this card in against them, but I'd rather just fight through those walls as is, since they're usually 0 power, and you can attack into them pretty safely. Mad Ratter is up next. 3 in a red for a 1/2 uncommon goblin. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, create 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens. Very odd red card, right? So this is not here because it's unplayable. It's here because you need a support in deck in order for this to work. If you don't have cantrips, if you don't have ways to draw extra cards, this card is horrendous. And even if you do, if you only have a couple, this card has a very bad starting rate. 4 mana for a 1/2 that requires you to put in extra work is not great. 4 mana especially means that the turn you cast this, you're probably not drawing extra cards. So you're probably not going to get a trigger off of it the turn you cast it, which means it has to survive through another turn, and then after that you still have to have ways to draw extra cards for it to matter. Now the payoff's pretty nice. A couple 1/1s every time you draw your second card each turn is not bad. If you get to trigger this, let's say twice in a game, you made 4 tokens, but at the cost of paying a 4 mana 1/2 with no evasion or anything like that. Very easy creature to pick off too. We'll see when we get to green. There are a lot of fight spells. Red has a lot of removal. Mad Ratter just doesn't seem like the type of card that I want for that deck. The reason it's really in this category, due to build around nature, is because it only fits in the blue-red deck. It is not a card you really want in any other red deck. You don't want this in red-white Knights. You don't want this in a red-black Knight deck or a red-green Stompy deck or anything like that. It's just a red-blue card, and that means it requires a lot of work before it becomes good. Claim the Firstborn is up next. It's a single red mana. It's an uncommon sorcery. Gain control of target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less until end of turn. Untap that creature and gains haste until end of turn. I normally don't like these, what do they call them? The active treason type effects. I'm blanking on the name. But I don't typically like these cards, whether they cost 2, 3, 4 mana, usually with a little bit of upside on the more expensive ones. They just don't do enough. They're usually burn spells. You take a creature, you hit your opponent with that creature, and then you give the creature back. And basically you used it as a burn spell. But you're down a card now. Your opponent didn't lose anything in that exchange, right? We'll see there's Fling, there's a couple sacrifice effects, but there's not really a full-on sacrifice deck going on here. And the fact that Claim the Firstborn can't take your opponent's biggest, most threatening creatures is a little bit worse, in my opinion. If this could take anything for 1 mana, it obviously wouldn't cost 1 mana, but it'd be a little bit better. As is, I'm not sure that there's a deck out there that really wants this card to pick off small creatures with Fling or anything like that. So I'm saying from the get-go, this card's probably unplayable. I just don't think the effect you get off of it when it can only take small creatures is going to be worthwhile. And it's a little weird. It's uncommon, right? Clearly, there's some power level here in a 1-mana way to get a blocker out of the way, but it only deals with small creatures, and that's just not going to cut it for me. Iron Crag Feet is up next. This is a bust rare, probably one of the most unplayable rares in the set. It costs 1 red. It's a rare sorcery. Add 7 red. You can only cast 1 more spell this turn. This card is hot garbage. This is the type of thing that makes sealed pools cry. There's no situation where you want to put this card in your deck. Imagine it's turn 7, you have 7 mountains on board, and you draw this card. It just doesn't do anything, right? There's not even, I think, a fireball or anything in this set where you can get gimmicky with it. It gives you 3 extra mana, essentially, but at the price of triple red and already having 4 mana, which usually means you're probably in a good spot, right? I can't imagine any deck wants this card, and there's really not much else to say about it. Don't play this. Another red rare, Fires of Invention. This is 3 in a red for a rare enchantment. It says you can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn. So this locks you out of instant speed stuff on your opponent's turn, and 2 spells per turn. Okay, well, that's the downside. What's the upside? You may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana cost. So if you have 3 lands on board, then you can cast up to 2 cards that cost 3 or less, but only during your turn and only 2, right? If you have 5 lands, you can cast up to 2 5-drops for free without paying their mana costs. You can still use your mana to cast other spells, but you're still locked out of instants, and you're locked out of 2 or you're locked into only casting 2 spells per turn. I don't really see the purpose of this card in Limited, unless you're playing like 5-drop deck, in which case that deck really fails if you don't draw the Fires of Invention. Then I'm not seeing why you would ever run this card in your Limited deck. It's clearly a constructed build-around card, and even then I don't think it's going to make the cut. So this is a little bit too gimmicky. It requires just way too specific of a deck, and it has a pretty negative drawback of just giving your opponent free reign on their turn, which I'm not a big fan of. So another one similar to Iron Crag Feet is not going to make the cut in my decks. And that takes us out of the sideline category into the filler cards. These are ones that will make your deck, but you're not excited about them. You usually wheel them if you can, and you're hoping to replace them with other cards. The first one, Weaselback Redcap, is a single red mana for a 1/1 common Goblin Knight. For 1 in a red, you can give it +2/+0 until end of turn. So you can kind of fireball your opponent a little bit if they don't block this thing. I've seen tons and tons of variations of this 1 mana little creature that can pay a bunch of mana to get bigger, and I'm just never impressed by it, especially when it doesn't pump its toughness. Any single creature can block this thing and it will die. Sure, this has the potential to deal a ton of damage, but that rarely happens, right? If your Weaselback Redcap is getting in there and your opponent just doesn't have blockers, then any creature can do the job that Weaselback Redcap is going to do. And you don't have to run the risk of this just being like a completely dead draw. Now, the reason this isn't completely unplayable is that it does trade up in combat, right? If your opponent's attacking you with a 3/3, you can block and pump this thing, and you'll trade off for the 3/3, and that's okay for your 1-drop, but I'm just not starting this card. I've never been impressed with these types of cards, unless there's really, really good ways to make creatures unblockable and get this in there turn after turn. I'm just not impressed. Thrill of Possibility is up next. It's 1 in a red for a common instant as an additional cost to cast the spell, discard a card. The effect, draw 2 cards. So this is Torment and Voice, but it's an instant this time, and that really doesn't make it that much better, right? Maybe for constructed, it's better to have an instant Torment and Voice than it is to have a sorcery speed Torment and Voice, but in Limited, the difference really doesn't matter, and to be honest, you probably want to cast this at sorcery speed anyway, since you're often putting this card in your deck to filter lands into spells, and you probably want to cast those spells when you draw them, right? So being an instant doesn't really matter too much here, and I would evaluate this exactly the same as I would evaluate Torment and Voice, which is just a fine playable card in some decks, but isn't really a card that you absolutely need. Note that people seem to think Thrill of Possibility and Torment and Voice is card advantage, but it's not. You're down 2 cards to get 2 cards, so it's just card parity. It doesn't hurt you, it doesn't harm you, but it is a little bit of a tempo loss to cast a card like this without actually getting an advantage. So save it until the late game when you have extra lands that you don't need, and then try to turn those lands into actual spells. Don't just cast this on turn 2 because you want to do something. It's not really worth it. 7 Dwarves is up next. 1 in a red for a 2/2 common dwarf. 7 dwarves gets +1/+1 for each other card named 7 dwarves you control, and a deck may have up to 7 cards named 7 dwarves. So I'm guessing if you have 8 7 dwarves in your sealed pool, you're only allowed to play 1 of them. Not sure how you ended up with 8, but I don't know, cheated. Who knows? 7 dwarves is fine. It's a 2-mana 2/2 at its base, which is where I would put this low pick. Or I would put that in the filler category as it is. 2-mana 2/2s just don't make the cut if they don't have extra abilities. But 7 Dwarves does get a little bit better if you have extra copies of it. I believe there was a green version of this card called Timber Pack Wolf in some of the core sets. I know it was in Origins. It was the same thing, but it was green, and it counted under Timber Pack Wolves. And if you could get 2 of those on board, they were actually pretty threatening. If you could curve 1 7 Dwarves on turn 2, into another one on turn 3, then you have 2 3/3s on turn 3, one of which can attack right away, and God forbid you get to slam any more 7 dwarves on board. So this is, excuse me, this is definitely a type of card I'll be trying out for by force for this set, but as it stands, I don't think the card is very good. You don't want one of these. You probably don't even play it unless you end up with 3 or more of them, and you need to be an aggressive deck too, right? This doesn't fill into any sort of Spellslinger type deck. It's clearly an aggressive card, and it wants you to have multiples, which means that it's probably filler. Alright, next up is Jank Central. Raging Red Cap is 2 in a red for a 1/2 common Goblin Knight. It's a double striker, so first thing to note here is that this is a knight that does matter for the set. Second thing to note is that this card really sucks unless you can augment it in some way. A 1/2 double striker is, for all intents and purposes, a 2/2 in combat, and unless you're augmenting that, you're paying 3 mana for a 2/2. So we just got through saying 7 dwarves is filler as a 2-mana 2/2. Imagine how I feel about a 3-mana 2/2, right? Of course, there are a lot of pump spells and things like that. A bunch of the adventures have pump spells attached to them, which makes this card a little bit more useful. And if you have some sort of payoff for playing knights, this card gets a little bit better, but you need to augment its power, right? You need to put an equipment on this, or you need to have some sort of ability that pumps knights, like the red-white uncommon that pumps other knights. Otherwise, this card is pretty poor. It's a common for a reason, right? You don't see double strikers that common too often, and they're usually pretty poor or pretty underpowered when you do see them. And this is a clear indicator that this card is not meant to be super powerful, but you can if you're able to pump its power. Fling, we just talked about Fling. It's 1 in a red for a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature, and Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. So usually when you want a Fling type effect is when you have active treason type effects in your format and you're able to take your opponent's creature and then fling their creature at something else, maybe kill 2 creatures with 2 of your cards, right? Even that's not card advantage, but it's pretty decent. Sets your opponent back quite a bit for spells in your hand. As it stands, Fling is a playable card. It's just not a very good one. There aren't a lot of huge high-powered creatures, so Fling is probably at its best in red-green when you can get your opponent down to like 5 or 6 life, and then you can fling like a 6/6 at them to win the game. As it stands, though, Fling is card disadvantage. You're going down a creature and down a spell to just deal damage, which can kill an opponent's creature. It can blank a removal spell. It's actually quite good against some of the blue removal spells like Frogify and the Sleep Lullaby, the claustrophobia type card. So if your opponent's playing pacifism type effects, Fling does get a little bit better because you can just sack the creature they put the enchantment on, but it probably won't deal that much damage anyway. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Fling. I think the best way to use it is wait for your opponent to use a removal spell on a big creature of yours and then fling it in response to try and blank their removal spell while also taking out one of their creatures. But all of that is very situational. It doesn't actually come up where it plays out that well. And normally Fling is just a 2-for-1, or rather a 1-for-2 in the opponent's advantage, just to get in a little bit of extra damage, and that normally doesn't cut it in limited. Crystal Slipper is up next. I'm not sure if this card's actually better than I'm giving it credit for or not, but I think it's It requires you to be attacking constantly for it to be that good, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in this filler category. It's 1 in a red for a common artifact equipment. It gives the equipped creature +1/+0 in haste, and it has an equip cost of 1. So we see designs like this a lot, where you can give a creature haste, but often at the expense of equipping something or using an activated ability of a creature that usually costs like a red mana or something, right? And what that means is that you're essentially paying 1 extra mana for the creature that you're playing in order to give it haste and let it attack right away. So imagine you have a 5 mana 5/5 in your hand and you want to give it haste. Well, you have to pay that with 6 mana to equip the Crystal Slipper and have that matter, right? Or activate whatever creature we're talking about here. And that just doesn't seem worth it. You're playing off curve to give your creatures haste when you could have just played on curve, and then by the time you get to the turn where you could have equipped and attacked, you could just be attacking with that creature anyway because you've already controlled it for a turn. So I'm not sure how I feel about Crystal Slipper. Obviously, if you're not just curving out, if you already have 6 lands on board and you're drawing 5 mana creatures or 4 mana creatures, then it gets a little bit better. They can start bashing. It gives a little bit of a power bump. But as it stands, I'm not normally impressed with these haste granting equipment that don't do anything else, and that's basically all the Slipper does. The 1 extra power is not worth the card that you're getting on this equipment here, and the haste really has to matter just every single turn of the game for this to be a card that's in your deck. If you are hyper aggressive, then sure, you might want a Crystal Slipper in your deck, but if you don't plan to be attacking every single turn of the game, or if you end up in a position where you have to play defense, the Crystal Slipper is going to look pretty embarrassing. Barge In is up next. Mediocre combat trick here. It's a single red mana for a common instant. Target attacking creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and then each attacking non-human creature gains trample until end of turn. So it's a little bit odd that you can't use this on defense, which is where I really like to use my combat tricks. But it's red, so you're probably attacking anyway. It has to be put on an attacking creature. +2/+2 is almost, it's usually going to be enough to win a combat, right? But it's not going to be enough to just completely devastate the opponent. It lets you usually trade like your 2/2 up for your opponent's 3/3 or something like that. Or you can trade off for a 4/4 at the expense of 2 for 1 in yourself. Not entirely sure at this time how important that trample is going to be, and the fact that it doesn't affect humans is a little bit weird, but we mentioned in a previous video that that's a theme of the set, non-human creatures mattering for some of the cards. It's a little bit of a flavor thing that just makes cards a little bit more annoying to evaluate and makes you address the board state a little bit more frequently, since a lot of the knights especially end up being humans. But this is just a mediocre combat trick. If you're in an aggressive deck that wants combat tricks, then you play this, and if you're in a defensive deck, you literally can't play this since it only gives attacking creatures the bump. Ferocity of the Wilds up next. Maybe another card I'm misevaluating. These cards tend to fluctuate depending on how aggressive a format is. It's 2 in a red for an uncommon enchantment. Attacking non-human creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample. So it's kind of like a static Barge In for all of your non-human creatures. I do think you're going to just end up drafting red decks where you happen to have like 4 or 5 humans, and this card doesn't affect them, which is really funny. It also does absolutely nothing on defense. It only works on attacking creatures. It's not even like on your turn creatures get the power bump. It's just attacking creatures. And trample is not exactly the most threatening thing on little red creatures, which is where you tend to want a card like this. Frosty of the Wilds is probably at its best in like a red-green monsters deck where you just have 6/6s and 7/7s, and then I can see it being quite good just because the trample is going to let you bash in for a bunch of damage, but I don't see any other archetype that really wants this card, and even then, again, this is a purely aggressive card like Crystal Slipper or Barge In. If you're not attacking, the card does nothing, and I tend to not want those sorts of cards in my deck. Fervent Champion, Javier Dominguez, is a single red mana for a 1/1 rare human knight. It has first strike and haste. When it attacks, another target attacking knight you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And equip abilities you activate that target the Fervent Champion cost 3 less to activate. Well, most of the equipment is fairly reasonable in this set, and there's some decent equipment, so being able to put that on a Fervent Champion, give it a power bump, and also still have it have first strike is pretty relevant. There are some curves where you'll play something like Fervent Champion on turn 1, and then some 2-drop equipment, and you'll just auto-equip because the equipment cost is free to equip to this thing, and you'll start bashing. Plus, if you happen to have other knights on board, it can pump those. That's a really minor thing, right? But as it stands on its own, as a standalone card, this card is quite bad. I don't care how many abilities you put on your 1-mana 1/1, even haste being one of them, that card just falls off super, super quickly as soon as your opponent plays a 2/2, unless you're taking advantage of that equip clause. So if you have equipment in your deck, then Fervent Champion is a card that you want in your deck. If you're just really grasping for any sort of knight, then this card will do the trick. It does pump your other knights at the expense of probably trading itself off in combat and forcing your opponent to block it. And it might chip in a little bit of damage early on, so it can play well with some of these other pump spells, even though it is a human, so it doesn't get barged in, it doesn't get Frosty of the Wilds. A little bit awkward there, but overall, I think this card is minorly playable and then goes up in value if you have a bunch of equipment or if you have Knight Synergies in your deck. Alright, no more talking about crappy cards. Let's go ahead and get into these solid cards. These are the ones that I actually want in my deck. They end up kind of filling out the deck and being the meat and bones of what's going to make your limited deck here. The first one is Searing Barrage, kind of your clunky red removal spell. It's 4 and a red. It's a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature, and it has an adamant bonus. If you spend at least 3 red mana to cast this spell, it deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. This is actually a very nice removal spell to have. It doesn't go to the opponent's face, but it does deal 3 extra damage a decent percentage of the time. I think most of these adamant cards that cost 5 plus mana, you should be able to get the adamant clause on them. Sometimes you have an awkward draw where you draw 2 mountains and 3 forests, and then your Searing Barrage is a little bit awkward. But you should still fire it off if you're getting beat down by an opponent's creature. But this has everything you kind of want in a clunky removal spell. It's instant speed, it deals enough damage to kill most things, it has an added little bonus with the adamant. It's fine, right? It's just not a card that you want 3 or 4 copies of in your deck. Due to just how expensive it is to cast. So I'm thinking 2 copies is probably where I'm happy to have Searing Barrage, and this is the type of card that does give you a little bit of a sign that red might be open. Also, for a fairly splashable card in some decks that don't have removal spells in them, so keep an eye out for that as well. Rimrock Knight is 1 and a red for a 3/1 common Dwarf Knight. It can't block, so 2 mana 3/1 non-blocker is again a super aggro card, and then this one has an adventure attached to it. For a single red mana, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So again, kind of going back to what I said about a lot of the combat tricks lose in value when there are adventured creatures in the set that also have combat tricks attached to them. I think Rimrock Knight is a pretty playable card. A 3/1 in red is exactly what you're looking for, especially when these cards want you to be attacking, right? Now, it's going to trade off a decent amount of the time, but if you can get value out of the Boulder Rush half and then just have this on board and trade it off, I think that makes for a fairly playable card. I think your red aggro decks that want to be beaten down are going to play as many copies of Rimrock Knight as you want, right? In a red deck that's looking to beat down, you want 3/1s more than you want 2/2s. So, yeah, I think this card is fine. I think you'll play as many copies as you can get if you're looking to beat your opponent down. And, yeah, I guess I'll stop saying that now since that's the 3rd time I've said it. Red Cap Raiders is 2 and a red for a 3/2 common Goblin Warrior. Whenever Red Cap Raiders attacks, you may tap an untapped non-human creature you control. If you do, it gets +1/+1 and trample until end of turn. So on its base, 3 mana 3/2, yeah, that's fine, right? That's not really a card we're excited about. That would certainly be in the filler category. But it has a little bit of an added bonus. It's a little awkward. Again, you have to tap a non-human creature, and you're probably just going to randomly have a bunch of humans in your deck. But, you know, there's dwarves, there's knights, there's stuff like that. Yeah, if you can tap a goblin or you can tap some creature that doesn't really have a profitable attack to make this either a better attack or threaten your opponent to trade off with a larger creature, then that's decent, right? A 3 mana 4/3 trampler at common is pretty good. That's definitely a good beatdown card, but it requires a little bit of work to put in. So this isn't something you're clamoring to have a bunch of in your deck. It's just a red creature that'll fill out your deck if you're looking to attack your opponent to death. Ogre Errant is 3 and a red for a 3/4 common Ogre Knight. When it attacks, another target attacking knight gains menace until end of turn. I think 4 mana 3/4 tends to be a body that is just a good standalone set of stats, right? That sort of creature tends to attack through a lot of the hill giants that they design in Limited, and it does look from this set that outside of green, there aren't a bunch of huge beefy creatures, so Ogre Errant should be able to tussle in combat quite well. If that Menace clause never comes up, this would still be a playable card, but the fact that it has the Menace clause on your other knights is pretty good. Also means that they're decent in multiples, since they could target each other if they're attacking. Nothing super impressive here, but I think this will make up kind of the gist of what you want in your knight decks, while also just being a decent attacker in your red decks that don't necessarily care about knights. Merchant of the Vale is 2 and a red for a 2/3. It's a common human peasant, and for 1 red mana, you can haggle. The adventure half says you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. That's fine. That would normally be card disadvantage and an extremely unplayable card, but the fact that you get to then cast this as a creature if you haggle first means that it's fairly free to do so, assuming that you have a card worth discarding. Similar to Torment and Voice, that makes this a good late game card where you just have an extra land in your hand that you no longer want, and you filter it into a different card. The creature half of this is a 3 mana 2/3 that says for 2 and a red, discard a card, draw a card. That is not a tap ability. That is just an activated ability. It costs 3 mana, and I think that's pretty solid. First things first, this is not necessarily an aggro card. This isn't the red card that you're looking for in your beatdown knight decks or anything like that. This is the card you're looking for in your defensive red-blue decks that care about drawing extra cards, where this is going to be quite good. You can activate this on your opponent's turn multiple times sometimes and get your triggers for your second cards, matter cards on your opponent's turn, or you can just activate it on your turn and get your triggers this turn. Plus, in just an average red deck that doesn't necessarily care about how many cards you're drawing or anything, this is a fine way to use your mana in a late game or maybe in a board stall, right? Just being able to turn extra land drops or small dorky creatures that no longer have an impact on the game into other cards is very relevant, and the fact that you can do it multiple times per turn is definitely a plus for the card. Not a busted card by any means, a little bit expensive to do the activated ability, and the adventure isn't exactly an impressive ability, it's just an added little bonus, but I think this card is going to get played quite a bit, and I think it's going to decide some of the games that it ends up being played in. Ember Earth Paladin is our red card in the +1/+1 Adamant cycle. It's 3 and a red for a common 4/1 haste. As it stands, I would hate that card. 4/1 haste is not where I want to be for 4 mana. Your opponent just ever expects that you're going to cast a 4/1 and they leave a 1/1 token back, and you look at this card and you cry. The Adamant bonus, as with the rest of the cycle, is that it gets a +1/+1 counter if you spent 3 or more red mana to cast the spell. And then it comes down as a 5/2 haste, which isn't significantly better, but does punk 1/1s quite well, while also just dealing a massive chunk of damage. Sure, if you play this as a 4 mana 4/1 and you get a hit in, that's going to be okay, right? You kind of lava axe to your opponent, but the 1 extra power and toughness matters for certain blocking situations. It does make your opponent block with a slightly better creature sometimes, or just take a giant chunk of damage. So I think this is going to be a playable card. Being a knight matters here as well. And if you can somehow use combat tricks with this, give it trample, maybe pump its toughness, something like that, then it's going to be a decent beater. So I do think this is a fine playable card in an extremely aggressive red deck or a knight deck, but not something you're looking for otherwise. Brimstone Trebuchet? I don't know what this word is. You can let me know below. I'm going to say Trebuchet is 2 and a red for a 1/3. It's a common wall. There you go. Blow your house down. It's an artifact creature. It has defender and reach. Okay. And for tapping the Trebuchet, you can deal 1 damage to each opponent. Boom. Each opponent. 2-headed giant. Get there. Whenever a knight enters battlefield under your control, you untap the Trebuchet. Yeah, I think these cards tend to overperform. You see designs like this sometimes where you get a pinger, usually a defender that untaps whenever a certain thing in the set happens. And in this case, that certain thing is having knights enter the battlefield. As it stands, this just pings your opponent on each end step, and that's a little bit of reach for red decks, especially if you can get multiples out, you can lock down the board. This thing does have reach, so it deals with annoying flyers, which red decks tend to be a little bit weak against, and yeah, I think it's fine. Cards like this don't look like something you want in an aggressive red deck, but if you have a bunch of knights, imagine every knight you played said when it enters the battlefield, deal 1 damage to your opponent. That's basically what this card lets them do, while also just getting in the extra pings while there are no knights entering the battlefield and blocking flyers. So I think it's fine. I don't think you want tons and tons of Ds, but if you're playing a defensive deck, maybe you don't even have Knights in your deck, then this could be a fine card. And I think it plays offense. It trickily plays offense quite well while playing defense reasonably well as well. Blood Haze Wolverine is up next. It's 1 in a red for a 2/1 common Wolverine. Remember that fable about the Wolverine? Yeah, me neither. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it gets +1/+1 and gains first strike until end of turn. I think that's actually kind of a decent combat trick to have on your turn. Basically, this is a 2-mana 2/1 unblockable creature, right? Anytime you attack with it and you have mana up, your opponent has to kind of assume that you have a way in your hand to draw extra cards. And I don't know, maybe you have the instant speed Torment and Voice, or you have an Opt or something like that. And sure, you can blow them out, but your opponent can also just choose not to block and take 2 damage. And then maybe you get an extra point of damage in, right? You're not breaking the bank if you trigger this in the middle of combat and get an extra point of damage, but you are if your opponent decides to block with their 2/2 and then you give it first strike out of nowhere. On defense, this card is not quite as exciting because it's a lot harder to draw 2 cards on your opponent's turn than it is to draw 2 cards on your turn. And if you're not triggering this ability, maybe you're not in blue-red, you're just in one of those aggro red decks that we keep talking about, then yeah, this card is pretty bad. It's a 2-mana 2/1 with virtually no text if you can't draw extra cards. So even worse than a single 7 dwarves, which is a weird thing to say. So Wolverine, you'll know the deck that you want it in. You'll have cantrips. You'll have extra ways to draw cards. Outside of those decks, pretty lousy creature. Skullknocker Ogre is 3 in a red for a 4/3 uncommon Ogre. Whenever it deals damage to an opponent, that player discards a card at random. If that player does, they draw a card. So I actually really like the design of this card. It's fairly aggressive. It cares about it's an ogre, so it works with all those non-human matter and combat tricks and the enchantment and so on and so forth. And it hits pretty hard, right? 4-mana 4/3, not really that much better than a 4-mana 3/4, which we mentioned with the other Ogre Knight. But this one has an interesting upside/downside, right? If you hit your opponent might just randomly discard the best card in their hand, some removal spell they haven't gotten to use yet. Or if they don't want to run the risk of it, they might have to chump block the Skullknocker Ogre, which is pretty decent too. But there are times, imagine that I'm sitting across from a Skullknocker Ogre, and I draw my only card for turn. I'm hellbent. I draw a land. I'm like, well, crap, this land's not going to do anything for me. I'll just let this Skullknocker Ogre hit me, and then I'll discard the land and draw a different card, and maybe then I draw something relevant. That's a way to use Skullknocker Ogre against itself. But I don't think that's going to come up too often, right? Plus, you have to take a hit for 4, which is what the red deck wants to be doing anyway. It's not exactly unstoppable in combat. 3 toughness on a 4-mana creature isn't going to win you games, right? That's often just going to trade off for a 3/2 or a 3/3 or something like that. But if it does hit, there's a little bit of an added bonus and a little bit of a sometimes downside. So I like the push and pull of this card. It's got an interesting design to it, and it's a nice creature to just include in your aggressive decks. Red Cap Melee is our card in the cycle, our red card in the cycle that cares about hating on its own color. This is a single red mana. It's an uncommon instant. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Well, if that was all it did, this would be busted, right? 1 red mana to deal 4 to a creature or planeswalker is very good rate, especially at instant speed. Doesn't hit players, but no matter. If a non-red permanent is dealt damage this way, you sacrifice a land. So the reason this one gets a pretty high grade as opposed to some of the others, like the black one that we looked at or the blue one, is that you can just play this card in your deck. If you are an extremely aggressive red deck, then you can afford to sacrifice a land to get a huge creature out of the way, right? Sometimes you trade 1 mana and a land to get your opponent's 4/4 out of the way and you just swing for game, right? This is an extremely efficient removal spell, and sometimes you just hit a red creature and there's no downside to it. You just get to pop your opponent's best red creature out of the way and you don't have to sacrifice a land. It's a little bit awkward that if your opponent's not playing red at all, you know for a fact you're going to have to sacrifice a land. But if your opponent's playing like red-black or something like that, and they're sitting here trying to block your creatures, you might be able to cast this on a red blocker and get away with it, or you might just cast it on a black blocker and lose a land to keep attacking. As it stands, I don't think you want a bunch of these in your deck, but you will certainly board in as many as you can against red decks, since it's just the most efficient way to get a red creature out of the way. Again, doesn't go to the opponent's face, so there's a limitation on what it can do, and that is a pretty hefty downside if you have to use it in the early game, which I imagine you don't want to do that. You want to wait until the late game when you have extra lands to cast this card. Joust is 1 in a red for an uncommon sorcery. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. The creature you control gets +2/+1 until end of turn. If it's a knight, those creatures fight each other. So I like this card. It's kind of like a red prey upon if you're not targeting your own creature. If you're not targeting a knight that you control, then this is just a 2-mana prey upon, which a red deck is fine with. Red doesn't have enormous creatures, so sometimes you don't get to actually use this as a one-sided removal spell. Sometimes you have to 2-for-1 yourself to get your opponent's big creature out of the way, but we see some 4-power, 5-power creatures, stuff like that. They usually have low toughness, so Joust isn't really going to work the way you want to, but this does give a power and toughness bump on knights, so that's really where you want to use this. You want to target one of your own knights, you want to clear one of your opponent's blockers, and then your knight still has that power bump until the end of turn, so you can get in some extra damage. Again, I don't think this is the most reliable removal spell, same as Prey Upon, right? But Prey Upon's in green, where you tend to have much larger creatures. This is in red, where you tend to have smaller creatures with lower toughness. So you should expect Joust to 2-for-1 yourself when you cast it a decent amount of the time, but there's also those times where you cast it on the knight, clear a blocker, your knight survives, and you just get in a ton of extra damage. And that's why this is in the solid playable category. Ember Earth Shield Breakers, 1 in a red for a 2/1 uncommon human knight. For 1 red mana, you can cast Battle Display, a sorcery that destroys target artifact. I actually really like the design of this card. It gives you a main deck artifact destruction in an aggressive deck, right? And there's a decent number of decks that want artifacts flown around. The blue-white decks are going to want tons of artifacts, and there's going to be a decent number of decks that all have access to equipment, plus sometimes you get to snipe those mythic rare artifacts, and that's going to feel really, really good when you play a creature that also kills your opponent's artifact. The fact that this has a floor of just being a 2-mana, 2-power creature, a bear, is fine, and we've kind of been poo-pooing that card for this entire video. The 2-mana, 2-power creature is not super exciting, but when it also gives you access to kind of this situational removal spell for some of your opponent's cards, it does get a lot better too. This can snipe a glass casket too, which might be locking down one of your creatures, and that would be very, very nice. A little bit narrow of a card, but I do think you want this as your bear over some of the other lousier bears in this set. Robber of the Rich. This card is really, really cool, but I don't think it's ultimately like a bomb or anything. It's 1 in a red for a 2/2. It is a mythic human archer rogue. It has reach and haste. It's Robin Hood. Get it? When it attacks, if defendant player has more cards in hand than you, that's the rich. You're Robin from the rich. If they have more cards in hand than you, you exile the top card of their library. And then for the rest of the game, during any turn that you attacked with a rogue, you may cast that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it, right? So you get to kind of like Gonti the top card of your opponent's library. They do get to see the card. Everybody gets to see the card, right? But you can use any color of mana. You do only get to cast it on turns that you attacked with a rogue, and this is not a rogue set. There are not a lot of rogues floating around. Robber of the Rich, I'm sure there's 1 or 2 others, but for the most part in red, this is the only rogue we've seen so far, and we're not going to see a lot of others. So this might as well say the turn that this card attacked, you may cast those spells. And the reason I put this in a pretty low category for a mythic rare is that it's a 2-mana 2/2. It's not super exciting. Even if it has haste, you're probably not getting more than 1 or 2 cards off of this. On turn 2, this is a very strong play, right? If you are on the play, you play this on turn 2, you attack. Your opponent probably has more cards in hand than you, so you get a card, and then the next turn, even if you have to trade this off in combat, you get another card, and you have until the end of the turn to play the cards that you got from the opponent. That's the turn 2 scenario. Sometimes you draw it on turn 5, it attacks, your opponent just eats it, and you blank on the card that you got off of it, and that's just not that good. It has reach, which is more of a flavor thing because Robin Hood is an archer. It doesn't really matter that much. You want to be attacking with this card, not blocking with it. But as far as the 2/2s in this set go, this is one of the better ones. It has the potential to get completely carried away, but if your opponent has a bunch of extra cards in hand than you do, they probably have answers to your cards. You're probably not getting through with this, so I wouldn't expect this card to go crazy, but there are situations where it can take over a game. Alright, enough with our 2-mana 2/2s. Let's get into our high power early pick cards. These are the ones that we want in our deck. These are the headliners for the color. Not the bombiest of the bombs, but cards that if you get them second, third pick, you're pretty excited to start off in red. The first one is Scorching Dragonfire, just straight up red's best removal spell. It's 1 in a red for a common instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and it exiles it if it dies this turn. You can't ask for much more than this. I mean, you could ask for it to hit players, but as far as creature removal goes, this is the efficient rate that we're used to and that we want in these sets. You know, your Jaya's Greedin type card. 2 mana, 3 damage, solid, simple. Definitely a sign that red is open. It won't deal with the biggest creatures, but we don't expect our 2 mana removal spell to deal with our opponent's 6-drop. This will hit a decent number of creatures, though, all the way from like their 2-drop to their 5-drop some number of the time, and that is definitely efficient. You will play this in any red deck, you'll play as many copies as you get, and you will be happy to do so. Sire Cora the Bold is 3 red for a 3/3 uncommon legendary human knight. Whenever Sire Cora the Bold or an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn, and then you have a tap ability to deal 1 damage to any target. So 5 mana 3/3 tapper that deals 1 damage to anything would already probably be a playable card, right? It could tussle in combat. It could make combat more difficult for your opponent by throwing around extra damage on their blockers or their attackers, so on and so forth. Or it could just get extra damage in on the opponent as, they set down their blockers and stabilize. But you get an added bonus too. Anytime anything goes to your opponent's face, besides combat damage, anytime you hit your opponent with damage, whether that's Sire Cora's ability or some burn spell or something like that, you get to just play the top card of your library that turn. So keep in mind, don't play your land drop until after you've activated this ability. So I actually see a play pattern a lot of where you'll just activate this at sorcery speed to essentially draw an extra card for the turn, and that's very strong on a red creature. These abilities tend to be very, very good in red because red can take advantage of having a bunch of extra cards. They usually have cheaper cards. They can cast multiple spells per turn, right? Plus, sometimes this incentivizes you to just use a burn spell on your opponent's face and then draw an extra card, hopefully get something relevant off of it. You can also play lands off the ability, which is quite nice. So, altogether, very card, kind of a fragile body for a 5-drop, but this sort of power, I think, is justified, and you will 100% play this in your red decks. Slaying Fire is up next. You'll see a theme of there being burn spells and removal at the high end of the red decks. The red picks, I should say. Slaying Fire is 2 in a red. It's an uncommon instant. It deals 3 damage to any target. Well, that's what we want, right, with our Scorching Dragonfire, but beggars can't be choosers. The Adamant bonus says that if at least 3 red mana was spent to cast this spell, it deals 4 damage instead, which is actually a reasonable bonus. Extra point of burn to your opponent's face or to their best creature can help you take out some things that the 3 damage couldn't. Obviously, this is one of those designs. We saw this with one of the black Adamant cards where the card only costs 3 mana. So if you want it to have the Adamant bonus, it might as well just be red, which is a little bit tougher to do earlier in the game if you're not in a monocolored deck, which even though this set kind of supports it, I don't think you should be running monocolored decks too often. Slaying Fire is just good on its own, though. 3 mana, 3 damage to anything at instant speed is actually a little bit of an upgrade, I think, to Scorching Dragonfire, since this can go to your opponent's dome and finish them off a decent amount of the time. The Adamant bonus definitely makes it better than Scorching Dragonfire, as there's a whole subset of cards that this can take out that Dragonfire couldn't, and it's uncommon for a reason, right? So these are both very comparable removal spells, but I think Slaying Fire is the one that you want most of the time. If you can't get the Slaying Fires, you'll be pretty happy with the Scorching Dragonfire, though. Moving on to Burning Yard Trainer. This is 4 in a red for a 3/3 uncommon human knight. It has Trample and Haste. 5 mana 3/3 haste. 5 mana 3/3 trample. Add those together, you're getting kind of a mediocre card, right? but it has an enter the battlefield trigger. When it enters the battlefield, another target knight you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample and haste until end of turn. This could actually add quite a bit of damage to the board, which is why I'm putting it in this high power category. I think most of the time it's actually going to play out as just a solid medium card, but there are some times where this just completely decimates your opponent, right? They've stabilized, you play this, and suddenly you're attacking for 5 extra damage on top of a creature that might not have been able to attack before. So this probably pushes in something like 7 or 8 extra damage out of nowhere that your opponent wasn't expecting to take. And then there are some really bad situations where your opponent didn't leave a blocker back because they thought you were racing, and then boom, here comes a Burning Yard Trainer and your opponent's dead, right? That won't happen every time, but it will happen a decent amount of the time. That I think this card is something to keep an eye out for. This is the type of card that if you're playing against a Knight deck in like maybe your first pre-release or your first draft, I would be aware that this card exists, otherwise you might just randomly die to it. Sundering Stroke is very interesting as a red card. It's 6 in a red for a rare sorcery. Yeah, red decks don't tend to want 7 drops, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Sundering Stroke deals 7 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. If at least 7 red mana was spent to cast this spell, instead Sundering Stroke deals 7 damage to each of those permanents and each player. Yeah, this card can potentially be busted. Now, here's the problem. If at least 7 red mana was spent to cast this spell and everybody goes back to that ritual, oh, that gives you 7 red mana. No, don't do it. Yeah, red is just not an achievable casting cost most of the time outside of a mono red deck. And I actually think Sundering Stroke is probably at its best in a non-red deck that's splashing it, because red decks don't tend to want 7 drops, right? Now, the effect here is very strong. Being able to deal 7 damage however you want among up to 3 targets is pretty nice. Usually what this will do is pick off a 3/3, pick off another 3/3, and then point of burn to the opponent's face, or pick off a token or something like that. Often you can get a nice clean 2-for-1 off Sundering Stroke while dealing some extra damage to something else. That's still 7 mana, right? Now, if you can somehow get, I don't know, 7 red mana, then this card will end the game. It deals 7 damage to your opponent while also killing their 2 best creatures, regardless of how big those creatures are. They're dying. Yeah, I don't know. The effect is extremely powerful, which is why I'm giving it a nod in the high power level category, but the condition is pretty expensive. If you can't get to 7 red mana, this is fine as a 2-for-1 in some sort of ramp deck. But in just your red aggressive deck, I don't think this is actually a card you want. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being one of the clunkers in the set that you just can't end up casting most of the time, or it just doesn't have a profound enough effect on the game when you do cast it. But it has some actually insane upside, which is why I'm going to go ahead and keep it in this category for now. Opportunistic Dragon is up next. 2 red for a 4/3 rare dragon. It has flying. When it enters the battlefield, choose target human or artifact an opponent controls. For as long as the Opportunistic Dragon remains on the battlefield, you gain control of that permanent, it loses all abilities, and it can't attack or block. So it kind of yeets your opponent's artifact, or it yeets one of their humans, and it just keeps it under your control, but it can't do anything, right? You can still sacrifice it if you have anything that cares about sacrifice and effects, which is kind of a nice little upside. But this is kind of your flavor win dragon. It's, you know, stealing the princess. It's stealing the crown. It's stealing the artifact, right? And it just kind of holds it. But once the dragon goes away, they get their card back. It's also very limited. It only hits humans as far as creatures go. So it's not like it just pacifies anything you want. It only hits humans, which is very, very narrow. Usually getting a little dorky creature or something like that out of the way. As it stands, though, this is a 4-mana 4/3 flyer, right? Even if you don't get to use the ability, it's still a very big beater that has to be dealt with. Essentially an air elemental that comes down a turn earlier, and that's already a card I'm interested in. Seems like a very strong first pick, better than majority of the other red cards that we see here. I'm interested whether people would think to take the dragon first or take something like Sire Cora, the pinger, because they seem pretty close in power level. But yeah, I think Opportunistic Dragon has the flavor win and is going to be played for its pure power, even if you ignore the activated, or rather triggered ability on it. Iron Crag Pyromancer. This is a very interesting card. It's 2 in a red for a 0/4 rare human wizard. Normally not a stat line that you want in your red decks, but this is a blue-red card, let's be honest. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, it deals 3 damage to any target. You get to bolt something every time you draw your second card each turn. This really wants you to be able to draw cards during your opponent's turn. So if you have any sort of way to draw multiple cards during an opponent's turn, you get to bolt on their turn, and then maybe you can cantrip on your turn, and then you get to bolt again. Yeah, this card can get extremely out of hand in a deck that's able to support it very, very well. Again, this is a red-blue card. Don't let the frame and the casting cost deceive you. This is not a card that your aggressive red deck wants. For any reason, maybe you have 1 or 2 ways in your deck to draw an extra card. That's not going to cut it. You need to be able to draw card after card, basically turn after turn, and the Pyromancer will just do the work for you. Picking off your opponent's creatures, and then once they don't have creatures on board, it gets to start going to face, which is kind of insane too. Can also mess up combat quite a bit for your opponent if they don't expect you to be able to just throw around 3 damage. It also blocks quite well too, which is kind of crazy for a red card. So yeah, overall, I think this card is going to end up being a bomb a decent amount of the time, but I can't justify putting it in the bomb category because it requires a lot of work for it to actually reach that status. Speaking of bombs, let's go ahead and kick that off with Torbran, Thane of Redfall. This is our triple color legend in red. It's 1 red. For a rare legendary dwarf noble, it's a 2/4, and it says if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. This is just an insane static effect to have for all of your red creatures, let alone any burn spells, right? You might be able to just burn your opponent out if you have this effect. Basically, your 3 damage spells become lava axes. Your lava axes deal 7 damage. You can just kill your opponent very quickly with this. If they don't block, they die, right? Because your creatures, all of your 2/2s are going to start dealing 4 damage now. And if they do block, they're probably trading down. If they, only have big creatures. This lets you push your 2/2s and your 3/3s into your opponent's bigger creatures because they'll deal 2 extra damage. And it's all one-sided. Normally when you see an effect like this, a Furnace of Wrath or Dictate of the Twin Gods, it affects both ways. Nope, this is only your red sources. So this will deal a ton of extra damage over the course of the game. On its own, it attacks as a 4/4 essentially and blocks as a 4/4. And that's quite strong. Triple red does mean you have to be devoted to red, but this card really, really wants you to be red, right? Some of the other ones you can get away with just playing them and not really caring about having too much of the requisite color in your deck. Now, if you're starting off with Torbran, you're drafting red cards as highly as possible, and they are going to be very good. Also note that this makes your burn spells more prevalent against your opponent's creatures. You can just, instead of aiming them at the opponent's face, you can take out a 5 toughness creature with a Scorching Dragonfire because it'll do 2 extra damage. So yeah, I do think Torbran is a bomb if you end up with enough red cards to support it. Bonecrusher Giant, this has gotten a lot of talk towards standard, but for limited I also think it's quite bomby. If not a bomb, then a very first pickable card, and probably a bit better than most of the uncommons, if not all of them. It's 2 and a red for a 4/3 rare giant, and whenever it becomes the target of a spell, it deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. So a little bit awkward if you want to pump this with a pump spell or something like that. You actually take 2 damage, but if your opponent wants to remove it off board, if they aim a removal spell or they try to lock it down with a some sort of enchantment or a Frogify or something, they're going to take 2 damage, which is quite nice. And assuming none of that stuff happens, a 4-mana 4/3 is a very nice beater. On top of that, you have the Adventure Stomp for 1 and a red. It's an instant, and it deals 2 damage to any target. Also says damage can't be prevented this turn, which could mess up protection, but there's, I think, only 1 protection creature in this entire set, so that doesn't matter too much. 2-mana Shock is still a very playable card in Limited, and a lot of times you'll use the Shock to take out your opponent's 2-drop, and then on turn 3 you'll play a Bonecrusher Giant, and you're just leaps and bounds ahead of your opponent. You've already 2-for-1'd them, and you have a 4/3 on turn 3, which is kind of incredible. Later in the game, this is still a pretty solid draw. Imagine for 5 mana, you had a creature that said, a 5-mana 4/3 that said deal 2 damage to any creature when it comes into play. That's kind of what Bonecrusher Giant does for 5 mana, and this has an installment plan while having some insane curve-out potential in the early game. So yeah, I think Bonecrusher Giant is a card you probably shouldn't be passing basically ever, and I'm very happy to first pick this card. That brings us into our final card of the set, Ember Cleave. This is our mythic rare red artifact for the set. It's 4 red for an equipment with flash, and it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature you control. So 6 mana is pretty hefty for an equipment. Actually very hefty, but excuse me, if you are able to cast this for 4 mana, let's say you're attacking with 2 creatures, you cast this for 4 mana, that actually makes this very, very good. The effect you get is +1/+1, double strike, and trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you can auto-attach it to a creature you control. The equip cost is 3 mana otherwise, but you get the first equip for free when it enters the battlefield, which is very nice, especially since it's often going to be on an attacking creature, assuming that you want the stat reduction. I mean, you can use this defensively if you have 6 mana up and just put it on a blocker without your opponent expecting it. But for the most part, you want to be attacking, and then you want to cast this mid-combat to either kill your opponent or just completely crush whatever blocker they decide to put in the way. +1/+1, double strike, and trample means that if your opponent's not expecting this, they block your creature with just a normal-sized creature, you're going to kill their creature and trample over damage, and now you're going to have this unstoppable creature on board that they're going to have to deal with. And if they do deal with it, you just pay 3 mana and move the Ember Cleave to something else. I think it's actually going to be very reliable that you get this down for maybe 3 or 4 mana in an aggressive red deck, and the fact that this can sometimes cost red is just absurd. So very powerful card, does exactly what red wants to be doing. It's not a creature itself, so it does require that you have a bunch of creatures to really have full potential. Sometimes you get stuck with cards like this in your hand, and all your creatures are dead, and then it looks a little bit sad, but any creature should do the trick, and Ember Cleave will be quite strong. So that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for red. We've got green next, and then 2 more videos after that. We'll do multicolor, and we'll do the artifact and lands in a separate video, just because there's a lot of each. There's 20 multicolor cards in the set, and then there's a bunch of artifacts. There's like almost 30 artifacts and a bunch of lands as well. So we'll knock that video out last. It'll be a little bit of a long one, but let's go ahead and wrap up the red video here. Red seems pretty strong, but man, do you need to be attacking for red to be good. There's a little bit of the blue-red, draw extra cards matters stuff floating around here, but for the most part, you need your blue cards to do the heavy lift in when it comes to drawing extra cards, whereas some of the red draw spells, they're not that great. The payoffs, though, are pretty good. So all that being said, if you're playing red, make sure you're attacking, start off with a bomb or something like that, and then just take aggressive creatures and ways to get them through the opponent. Seems decent to me. Stay tuned next time for the green video. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe below and let me know in the comments whether this is useful information or whether I'm just a floundering idiot who speaks too much. You can also find us on Twitter, MTG_Manarocks. Alright, thanks for hanging around. My name's Timothy. See you all in the next one.